Hello, you are most welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to today's tutorial. Today we are going to look at the major salivary glands. Now remember that we have minor salivary glands which are going to secrete saliva continuously in the oral cavity, ensuring that the oral cavity is actually moist or wet all the time. Yes, for the major salivary glands, they are just three and paired, unlike the minor salivary glands which are found in the submucosa of some oral structure, which we'll look at later. And they secrete there are actually more than 700 of them, close to 1,000. But for the major salivary glands, they are just three and paired. So I'll show you where we are going to find them. We are going to look at their role that they are going to play as far as saliva production is concerned. Now remember, for the major salivary glands, they are going to secrete saliva continually. Yes, it's not going to be continuously, it's going to be continually. So appropriate nervous stimulation, yes, will ensure that saliva is actually secreted by the major salivary glands. So for instance, anticipation of food, presence of food, even the smell of food, yes, all these ones will be important stimuli to ensure that copious volumes of saliva are secreted by the major salivary glands. We'll get to know that yes, we know that saliva will be very important as far as lubrication of food is concerned. There are some salivary glands which are going to produce a lot of, let me say, viscous or less watery saliva to help in that kind of lubrication of food, to aid in actual deglutition or actual swallowing. Very important. Saliva will also contain something like lysozyme. Yes, it will also contain immunoglobulin A, which are going to be very protective as far as, of course, the innate immune system is concerned. Yes, not only that, we know that they will also aid in what we call the chemical digestion of food by way of secretion of some important enzymes, okay, to help in actually digestion, principally carbohydrate digestion, with the kind case of alpha amylase. Yes, we are going to actually see all these will be important functions of of course the saliva. So it means that saliva secretion is very important. Minor salivary glands going to secrete saliva continuously. Major salivary glands, which we are going to deal with today, secreting saliva intermittently or secreting saliva continually upon appropriate nervous stimulation actually. So now we have three main of course major salivary glands, and these major salivary glands, yes, are, so with respect to what I'm going to do, yes, we are going to look at what we call submandibular gland, yes, which is formerly used to call it submandibular gland. It lies in what we call the submandibular fossa in the of course the body of the mandible. We are going to see that one. Then of course we also have sublingual gland, yes, under the tongue, also find itself in the sublingual fossa in actually the body of the mandible. We will see that one. Okay, and then we also have what we call the parotid gland, yes, actually, yes, anterior and inferior to what we call the ear or external acoustic meatus. We are going to have what we call the parotid gland. Now each of these glands, now generally we say that minor salivary glands are within structures of the oral cavity, and therefore they will have very short, of course, ducts. We know that these glands are actually exocrine glands, and therefore they will convey their secretion via what we call ducts. Now for minor salivary glands, because they are within the oral cavity itself, for instance in the tongue, yes, in the oral part of the lip, yes, oral part of the palate, that of the buccals, okay, that's the cheeks, their duct will be quite short, okay, shorter compared to that of the major salivary glands, which of course, for instance, the parotid gland will have to send a duct all the way here until it reaches the oral cavity. Yes, the submandibular gland similarly. Yes, but this sublingual gland is quite close to the oral cavity. Okay, it lies in the floor of the oral cavity, and therefore have numerous short ducts to convey the product into the oral cavity. So we actually be seeing all these ones. So without much ado, yes, let's begin with the submandibular gland. So actually submandibular gland, yes, as we've been talking about, is one of course the paired major salivary glands, okay, that we are going to have. Formerly we used to call it the submandibular gland, but right now the correct name is submandibular gland. Now it's actually a mixed gland. We will actually see that it will have both mucous acina and of course serous acina, actually having more serous than mucous acina. Now we're saying that in humans it will account for approximately 70% of the volume of the saliva. Now in normal cases, with its weight being around 15 grams. Okay. Now important thing that we have to know is that yes, during stimulated, appropriate stimulation, what will happen is that most of the volume of the saliva will actually be coming from what we call the parotid gland. Being actually watery, will be coming from the parotid gland. But normally, if the stimulation is not appropriate enough, yes, you may have some quantity actually coming from what we call the submandibular gland. So that's what we have to know about this submandibular gland. Now, this submandibular gland actually lies in an area which we call it the submandibular triangle. Now, because the submandibular triangle is actually having boundaries bounded by both the anterior belly and of course the posterior belly of what we call the digastric muscle, then we say that this triangle, which we also call it the submandibular triangle, it can also be referred to as the digastric triangle. Now get to know that yes, I've done a video on the triangles of the neck, okay, so that I can actually have various things. But for now, what I will say is that yes, superiorly, this triangle of course will be bounded by what we call the body of what we call the mandible, inferior aspect of the body of the mandible, together with an imaginary line which will be taken from the angle of the mandible to what we call the mastoid process, will be actually the superior boundary. Then of course anteriorly will be by what we call the anterior belly of what we call the digastric muscle, and then of course posteriorly will be by what we call the posterior belly of the digastric muscle. So these ones will be the boundaries of this triangle which we call the submandibular triangle, and that is where the submandibular gland can be found. Of course, we know that the floor will be formed by what we call the hyoid muscle, which actually forms the diaphragm of the oral cavity. So diaphragm oris will be the hyoid muscle, which if I cut and reflect this hyoid muscle, I will have what we call the hypoglossal muscle, and then deep to that we also have what we call the middle constrictor muscle, middle constrictor muscle. So that's one thing that you have to actually know regarding what we call the submandibular gland lying in the submandibular triangle. Now, so here we are. This one half, actually the left part, we know the mandible will actually be formed from actually two parts. This is the left part, the right part, which will be formed in the midline by the symphysis menti. But essentially what we are saying is that yes, this line over here on the internal, on the medial aspect of what we call the body of the mandible, provides attachment to what we call the hyoid muscle, and therefore this line over here is known as hyoid line. Now on the anterior superior aspect of this hyoid line, we will have this point where the sublingual gland will lie, and therefore we call it sublingual fossa. We look at that one. But on the posterior inferior aspect of this hyoid line, we have the place where the submandibular gland will actually lie, and therefore we call this fossa submandibular fossa. So we'll actually be looking at all these ones. So these are important bits that you have to know. You have to know the area where the sublingual gland will lie, the area where the submandibular gland will lie, and of course what is separating them. That's the hyoid line. Of course, in the living, the muscle which will take attachment here will be the hyoid muscle. So actually yes, this is a submandibular gland. Now this submandibular gland is actually having two parts: a larger part which we call the superficial part, and then a smaller part which we call the deep part of the submandibular gland. Now the superficial part, yes, it will lie somewhat inferior to what we call the posterior half of the mandible. Posterior half of the mandible, and it will lie in the submandibular fossa. So if you talk about the submandibular fossa, it's actually the superficial part which lies in the submandibular fossa. Of course in the medial aspect of what we call the body of the mandible. So you can see that this part, where the superficial part, is actually found outside the oral cavity. It's found outside the oral cavity. But if you look at the deep one, it's a bit in the floor of the oral cavity. Okay, so this one is actually small, and it's actually, can you see that, it hooks around this muscle. This muscle over here is the hyoid muscle, so more or less hooks around it, okay, to enter or to get into the floor of the oral cavity. Okay, so it tells us that yes, but for you to actually enter the floor of the oral cavity, there's a triangular aperture over here. Okay, there's an aperture over here for you to get to to go superior to what we call the hyoid muscle and enter the floor of the oral cavity proper. Okay, so that is one thing that you have to know. By so doing, it lies lateral to what we call the hypoglossal muscle. Okay, so there's going to be a bone over here, the hyoid bone, which you have to know about the hyoid bone, and then there will be tongue. So the muscle connecting them will be the hypoglossal muscle. So it's this deep part will lie actually lateral to what we call the hypoglossal muscle. Okay, so the hypoglossal muscle will be medial to this one. Okay, so that's one thing that we have to know. So that is the submandibular gland. Okay, submandibular gland. Now the submandibular gland, so there we are. Okay, that's the submandibular gland. Now imagine from the deep part, so this is the deep part. Now you can see there's the hyoid muscle. So we said that it hooks around that hyoid muscle and forms part of the floor of the oral cavity. So it means that yes, this is the deep part of what we call the the submandibular gland. Yes, you can see next to it you have what we call the submandibular gland. Now imagine, okay, from the anterior aspect, okay, or anteromedial aspect of the deep part of the submandibular gland is its duct. Now usually in the living, most of the time it takes a tortuous course. It is not that straight as we find over here. Sometimes it takes a tortuous course, and that is where I'll talk about clinical application. I'll look at that one. So this one is roughly 5 centimeters long. So you can see that yes, after emerging from the anteromedial aspect of the deep part of the submandibular gland, yes, it goes actually between what we call the hyoid muscle. Okay, it goes actually between the hyoid muscle, which you can actually see here, as well as what we call the hypoglossal muscle. Okay, there will be another muscle known as hypoglossal. I told the hyoid bone, as well as of course the tongue, so hypoglossal, as well as the genioglossus muscle. Now genioglossus, please visit the video that I've done on the mandible as well as the hyoid bone, so that you can actually understand these attachments. The genial tubercles. Okay, that's where the genioglossus will take attachment to actually combine and also attach to that of the the tongue. So these are the things that we have to know. Okay, so you will get to know that yes, that the duct actually moves superiorly. Okay, and it will open, we will actually see 1 to 3 orifices on a small area, which we call it the sublingual papilla or sublingual caruncle. Okay, so you will actually see it. Okay, so there's the tongue. So anything that is below the tongue, we say sublingual. Now the word lingual has to do with tongue. Okay, now there is a mucosal fold that connects the inferior aspect of the tongue to the floor of the oral cavity. Okay, and that is what we call the lingual frenulum. Around the area of the lingual frenulum, we have what we call an elevation. Okay, there's an elevation over here which we call it sublingual caruncle or sublingual papilla. So what happens is that around this, if you can identify the lingual frenulum, then you can also see what we call the sublingual caruncle at its base. Okay, and that is where the 1 to 3 ducts, okay, of the submandibular gland will actually open. Okay, usually it's 1, but it could be up to 3. Okay, so that is one thing that we have to appreciate as regards the sublingual submandibular gland. So now I told you that the submandibular duct usually takes a tortuous course. Okay, so if it takes a tortuous course, then there is that kind of pathology which can actually happen. Now, not only because it takes a tortuous course, perhaps because of its ascent. Okay, because it ascends upwards. Okay, that one can also happen, and that is what we call salivary duct calculi. Okay, so there will be stone, and that is also what we call cyaulolithiasis. So you can see this kind of calcified material over here, and that is what we call salivary duct calculi or cyaulolithiasis. So usually we say that in about 4/5, okay, of the cases of calculi or cyaulolithiasis, what happens is that yes, which actually blocks the lumen. Okay, that's the salivary duct. Okay, so that's the lumen of the salivary duct. What happens is that yes, in most cases there's the ducts of the submandibular gland, okay, that we tend to see it. And I've given the reason. Yes, the reason is that possibly because of a tortuous course that it takes in the living, and then because of perhaps how the way it ascends, upwards, Now, one key thing that you have to, actually bear in mind over here is that yes, if you have, such a phenomenon, then we have to actually, remove it. Otherwise, there will be that kind of pressure, increased pressure, because the fluid cannot actually go through it. Okay, there will be increased pressure within it. Okay, so that is, the cyaulolithiasis. All right. So the next one, we want to also know the relationships, that the submandibular, gland, as well as of course the submandibular duct, okay, will have with, other, other structures. So importantly is this nerve over here, which is known as the lingual nerve. This lingual nerve, yes, actually will commence somewhere on the lateral aspect of the mandibular gland. Okay, this is the mandibular duct. Now get to know that the ducts of the submandibular gland can also be referred to as Wharton's duct. So there's the ducts of the submandibular gland. So actually emerging, okay, on the now look at this. It actually commences on the lateral aspect, okay, somewhere here, lateral aspect of what we call the ducts or the Wharton's duct or the submandibular duct, okay, lateral aspects of what we call the Wharton's duct, and then it loops, you can see that it loops around where we have, the duct of the submandibular gland, okay, and then it will actually, end, move upwards to end by giving, several branches, which will supply, both, the external as well as the superficial aspect of the hypoglossal muscle, and also it will also provide some kind of, generalized, somatic, afferent innervation to the mucous membrane on the what we call the anterior two thirds of the tongue. The tongue is going to have two parts. When you look at the tongue, you look at it, the anterior two thirds, will be sensory in function. Okay, so it means that if there's any surgery, okay, if there's a problem with, the submandibular, duct or its gland, then care must be taken so that you don't injure the lingual nerve. Otherwise, there could be some kind of sensory loss. Actually, it's transient anyway, to the anterior two thirds of what we call the tongue. Yes, even apart from that, there is another nerve. Okay, this nerve over here, which is also intimately related to what we call the gland of what we call the submandibular gland, is known as the hypoglossal nerve. Hypo means below, so below the tongue. So the tongue will be in the floor of the oral cavity. So below the tongue, we are going to have what we call the hypoglossal nerve. So it tells you that yes, this hypoglossal nerve will be located deep to what we call the submandibular gland. Okay, to actually be deep to the submandibular gland. Okay, this one will be a bit superficial, okay, to the submandibular gland, but importantly it will be superficial. Okay, so you can see this muscle over here, which is taking origin from the hyoid bone all the way to the tongue, so the hypoglossal muscle. Okay, so it will be superficial to what we call the hypoglossal muscle. So this muscle, yes, will be very important, in actually supplying some, areas of the tongue, okay, giving it some kind of motor supply to the tongue, so that if there is lesion to this nerve, if it's, ipsilateral, then what happens is that that side that the lesion or the injury happened, perhaps as a result of, performing surgery on this gland, submandibular gland, then we are going to have what we call, paralysis, okay, of the tongue, the lateral, that part of the tongue which is actually supplied by, that particular nerve, okay, the hypoglossal nerve. Okay, so that is one thing that we have to actually appreciate. But then there is another nerve which I want to show you here, and that nerve is actually a branch of the facial nerve. Okay, that nerve is known as the marginal mandibular branch of the facial nerve. Marginal mandibular branch of the facial nerve. So this nerve, yes, actually will be very important, okay, in actually supplying some muscles of facial expression, because the facial nerve actually supplies some muscles of facial expression. Therefore, it means that if there is paralysis to it, then those muscles which are supplied by that portion of the marginal branch of marginal mandibular branch of the facial nerve will be actually suffering. Talk about it importantly will be the depressor labii inferioris. Okay, depressor labii inferioris muscle. So please visit the video that I've done on facial muscles to get more insight in this regard. If that happens and there's weakness or there's paralysis to the muscle, then it may lead to what we call drooping of the lower lip. So the lower lip may droop. Okay, may droop. So why are we saying that actually this marginal branch of what we call marginal mandibular branch of the facial nerve, why is it very important that we talk about it? Because it's related to, of course, the submandibular gland. It's related more to the submandibular gland, because you realize that yes, it will leave it will leave the anterior inferior aspect of the of the gland. So anterior inferior aspect of the the gland. So assuming there's a gland over here, okay, this is actually the lymph nodes. So if the gland is here, then leaving on the anterior inferior aspect of the gland, which is the submandibular gland, then it's going to pass on the marginal aspect of the mandible. So now you see that this is the area where it's related to, is the level of the angle of the mandible. Okay, so it will leave this way, and then of course move to the anterior aspect, superior to the anterior aspect of the body of the mandible. Okay, so this nerve, because of its proximity over here, then it could be injured. It could be injured in that regard. Yes, so let's look at the blood supply. So we begin with the arterial blood supply to the submandibular gland. So the arterial blood supply mainly, yes, look at this. Now all these branches that we are going to talk about, they are actually coming from what we call the common carotid artery. So please visit the video that I've done on the common carotid artery to actually know where these branches are coming from. But here is the common carotid artery. I'm interested in the external carotid artery, actually the external carotid artery. So this is the submandibular gland. So you can see that one branch of the common external carotid artery is what we call the lingual artery. Okay, now this lingual artery will give a sublingual branch to supply the submandibular gland, Okay, so that's one thing that you have to know. Again, there's also a branch which is called the facial artery, and this facial artery will also give a branch which we call the submental submental branch to supply the submandibular gland. But at the end of the day, yes, whether it is facial artery which is given a submental branch, whether it's a lingual artery which is given a sublingual branch, both of them, yes, who actually are branches of what we call the external carotid artery. But one thing that you have to also know is that yes, they will be drained by what we call the corresponding veins. So if it is sublingual vein, yes, it will be drained by what we call the lingual vein. Then of course, if it is the facial the facial vein, then it will actually drain into what we call the internal jugular vein. You actually see that one. But one thing that I have to show you is that with these major salivary glands, there are some nuclei from the cranial nuclei actually in the pontine area, in the pons, lower aspect of the pons. There's actually the pons, supposed to be from the pons, not over here, supposed to be coming from the pons. and these are what we call the superior salivatory nucleus and of course inferior salivatory nucleus. Now we look at neural anatomy, you actually be able to understand these things. Now when we say a nucleus, it's a collection of what we call cell bodies actually coming from what we call the CNS, and we know the brain, the pons is part of the brain stem, so it is actually a nucleus. So we have what we call superior salivatory nucleus and inferior salivatory nucleus. Now you can see that there is the superior salivatory nucleus. In its course, okay, it decussates with what we call the inferior salivatory nucleus. Okay, so they cross over here, and then the superior salivatory nucleus actually comes down, and then the inferior salivatory nucleus actually ascends upwards. Now let me tell you something about this. Now the inferior salivatory nucleus will actually supply in the secretomotor pathway. We actually look at these ones in terms of the secretion. Of course, the parasympathetic secretion, influence to secrete for the secretion of saliva by these glands. Then we'll be interested in knowing that the inferior salivatory nucleus, okay, will actually be supplying the superior gland. Although the parotid gland is at a higher level, it will be supplied by what we call the inferior salivatory nucleus. Okay, inferior salivatory nucleus. Alright, that's what we are going to actually see. Inferior salivatory nucleus. Now it will do that via what we call cranial nerve 9. So I will actually go through these ones. Then we also have what we call the superior salivatory nucleus, okay, which will actually decussate and come down to supply the two glands, okay, which are at the lower level, of course, the sublingual gland and the submandibular gland, okay, via what we call the superior salivatory nucleus. We actually look at the submandibular ganglion. We actually look at where there's that kind of synapse over there. So that is one thing that you have to know, that superior salivatory nucleus, although it's at the upper level, it is supplying both the glands which are below, and that is the submandibular gland and of course sublingual gland. So there we are. Now get to know that in terms of secretion, then of course under the autonomic nervous system, then you have to know that yes, it is actually the parasympathetic nervous system who is going to ensure that secretions actually take place. Then of course if it is sympathetic, that is taking dominance, then what happens is that there will be less secretion, okay, of saliva. So there we are. This is the pons. So within the pons, we said that we are going to have what we call superior salivatory nucleus, okay, superior salivatory nucleus, and this superior salivatory nucleus via what we call presynaptic fibers, okay, actually which will travel through this nerve, which is a branch of the facial nerve, which we call the chorda tympani. So it will travel through this chorda, so the synaptic fibers of the superior salivatory nucleus will travel, okay, through what we call the chorda tympani, which is a branch of the facial nerve. Now prior to anastomosis over here, or prior to synapsing in what we call the submandibular ganglion, okay, what will happen is that this chorda tympani, which is actually taking the presynaptic fibers of what we call the superior salivatory nucleus, will join with what we call the mandibular nerve, actually the lingual branch of the mandibular nerve. Okay, mandibular nerve is one of the it's actually the third division of the trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve 5. Okay, that's the cranial nerve 5. So it will combine over here to join with it, and then of course at this area where we have what we call the ganglion, which is the submandibular ganglion, what will happen is that yes, the fibers, the presynaptic fibers which were running in the chorda tympani will actually synapse over here, and then of course they will give that kind of supply to what we call the sublingual gland, as well as of course the submandibular gland. So it tells you that yes, over here there will be relay. Okay, this will be the relay station because there's a ganglion over here. So these ones will be the post-ganglionic fibers. Okay, so post-ganglionic innervation, okay, will cause direct induction on the glands to secrete. So I'm interested in the submandibular gland to actually secrete. And there will also be what we call vasomotor fibers. Okay, there will also be vasodilator fibers, okay, which will accompany the arteries to enhance blood supply to the gland. So if there is increased blood supply to the gland, then it means there's increased activity, so that it can actually secrete its product. Okay, so that is the pathway for what we call the secretion of saliva. So please get to know that yes, the fibers that's actually coming from the superior salivatory nucleus will give off the presynaptic fibers. They will run through the quadrant tympani, which is actually a branch of the facial nerve. It will actually combine or join with what we call the lingual branch from the mandibular nerve, a branch of the the trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve 5, third division of the cranial nerve 5. Then of course over here they will actually synapse the presynaptic fibers or synapse, okay, in what we call the submandibular ganglion. Okay, so when they synapse in the submandibular ganglion, yes, they give off these fibers, which also form that kind of synapse with the postganglionic fibers, and these postganglionic fibers will cause direct induction, okay, on these glands to actually secrete. And I'm saying that they also vasodilator fibers, okay, which will, if there's vasodilation, then means more blood, okay, will accompany the arteries to supply the gland. So that's the parasympathetic innervation. Remember that parasympathetic innervation will ensure that there's copious volumes of saliva secretion. Now for sympathetic, which is not very important, yes, it will be coming from actually the superior cervical ganglion, superior cervical ganglion, and that one, it means that one will cause vasoconstriction, okay, because the synovial fibers will give off what we call vasoconstrictive fibers, okay, which will travel along with the arteries to cause vasoconstriction, to ensure that there's less blood to the glands, and therefore secretion will be reduced. If that's the case, then small volume of saliva will be produced, and if small volume of saliva, then it means that it will be rich in actually enzymes. It will be rich in enzymes. So that's one thing that you have to know about the superior salivatory nucleus, actually, of course, the secretomotor pathway of the submandibular gland, and even the sublingual gland. Actually, I will look at that one again. Now get to know that I told you about the superior salivatory nucleus. The superior salivatory nucleus, the caudal portion, okay, the inferior portion of the superior salivatory nucleus is what we call the lacrimal nucleus, which will actually supply the lacrimal gland so that it can actually produce tears. Okay, so that is one thing that you have to know. Now, before I move on, one thing that you have to know is that yes, we are saying that these glands that we are looking at are exocrine glands, and therefore they will have cells which will make the product. These cells are referred to as acinar. Now there are two acinar depending on what kind of secretion will be coming from the gland. If it's watery secretion, then it will be serous acinar. If it is mucus or sticky secretion or more viscous secretion, then we call them mucus acinar. Now sometimes of course, for instance, the submandibular gland, I've told you that it's a mixed gland, and therefore we produce both serous and mucus secretions, in fact more serous than mucus, and therefore we have what you call a mixed gland. If it's a mixed gland, then it will produce serous as well as mucus secretions. So there we are. The cell, okay, is pyramidal shaped. It's pyramidal shaped. Now what we find is that yes, it will have a nucleus, a rounded nucleus, which is more closer to the base. Now this is the base and this is the apical portion. So the nucleus is more closer to the basal portion than to the apical portion. Okay, now again, above the nuclei will be some granules, because this one is going to produce enzyme rich product. If it is more serous, then it will produce more enzyme rich product. Now the enzyme rich product will be coming from these granules, which we call them zymogen granules. Okay, because they are going to produce these kind of proenzymes. A zymogen is a proenzyme, so those kind of proenzymes which will be activated later. Okay, so that's one thing that you have to know. Then of course, because it's going to produce this one, then it has rich supply of what we call mitochondria. So you have a lot of mitochondria in here. Okay, but one key thing too that you have to know will be the basal foldings. So the plasma membrane of the serous acinar, okay, have what we call basal foldings. very important. And of course, within these areas, you have what we call mitochondria also being there. Okay, mitochondria will also be there. So you can have all the organelles. Here's the protein synthesis machinery. Here's Golgi apparatus. Here's the endoplasmic reticulum. Actually, rough endoplasmic reticulum will also be there. So that's what we have to know about serous asigna. Serous asigna. Okay, so that's one key thing that you have to know. Now, because they are serous, they tend to pick up the stain quite intensely. Okay, they pick up in H&E staining. They pick up the stain quite intensely. Okay, so as we move on, we see other things. Now the other one is known as mucous asigna. So it will be producing more viscous secretions. And the mucous asigna, I need not to tell you that they appear pale because they have on the apical portion, okay, they have what we call these granules, which we call them mucinogen granules. And that is why during staining, these mucinogen granules, they take up water. They swell in a process we call mucinogen swelling, and as they swell, they push downwards against the nucleus, so that the nucleus, which normally we know this cell is actually columnar shaped, okay, sometimes it could be pyramidal, but mainly it's columnar shaped, may be pushed down instead of the nucleus also being columnar shaped. Yes, it is pushed down to assume this flat nature. So that is why mucous asigna, the cells appear flattened, although the asigna appear columnar. So these are how the things are going to be. Yes, of course, that there will also be some granules, okay, will be there, but actually you can see this is actually mitochondria, okay, doing some kind of synthesis as well. Of course, it's going to make those kind of mucinogen, and of course that there's the endoplasmic reticulum, okay, both rough and smooth. But of course, compared to that of the serous asigna, then you have more of those things, okay, the protein synthesis machinery compared to that of the mucous asigna. So you actually see those ones. So by way of comparing serous asigna to mucous asigna, then you know that serous asigna will produce less viscous fluid, but mucous will produce viscous fluid. Then serous asigna, because it's going to produce a lot of protein material, yes, it's going to be proteinaceous, so to speak, or rich in enzymes, then this one will produce a lot of mucopolysaccharides, yes, mucous in nature. Yes, I've told you that there will be zymogen granules, there will be mucinogen granules over there. Then of course the nucleus, yes, it's not entirely centrally placed, but it's more closer to the base. It's rounded, but this one appears flat, and it's more closer to the base. Okay, then because the serous asigna, they take up the stain quite intensely, their lumen appears quite smaller compared to the lumen of what we call the mucous asigna, because over here will be pale, so you might think there's there's an empty space, but actually pale as a result of picking up the stain less intensely and the H&E staining. So of course there will be the cell boundaries will be distinct in the case of the mucous asigna, but will be less indistinct in actually the case of serous asigna. Then we've said all these things. Now mainly we will get to know that we will have only in the adult, we have only serous asigna in parotid gland, but in sublingual gland as well as in submandibular gland, which we are looking at, we actually see mucus as well there. But remember that we also see the serous cells in also submandibular as well as sublingual, but the proportion will vary, because we are going to have more mucus, in fact entirely serous in the case of parotid gland, more mucus in the case of sublingual gland, okay, than serous, then more serous in the case of submandibular gland than mucus. We will actually see these ones. So having talked about this, now we said that some glands are mixed, just like submandibular gland we are looking at, as well as sublingual gland. So we see that yes, you may have, yes, you can see these are pyramidal, triangular pyramidal structures, okay, actually columnar in nature, it's supposed to be columnar in nature, and this one is the mucous asigna, mucous cells. Then of course we also have what you call the serous asigna. Actually you have it to be that in a particular gland you have both mucus and serous, but during staining, as a result of mucinogen swelling, then what will happen is that apart from pushing the nuclei of the mucous asigna to the periphery, flattening them, they also push away the serous acina, forming a cap of serous cells on top of mucous secretory units. And therefore, we have such a thing. We say that this is a maize gland, and that cap is known as serous demilune. Serous demilune, as if it's a half moon. Demi means half, so serous demilune. Okay, that's what we find. Now I said that the secretion, okay, if you visit the video that I've done on the glandular epithelial tissues, then you get to know that there will be other cells which we call them basket cells or myepithelial cells, which are contractile in nature, so that they can contract to expel the secretion into the lumen. We actually see those ones. So that is that for you. So we have the secretory units, okay, covered by what we call myoepithelial cells, basket cells. Upon contraction, we expel the secretion into the duct system, and the duct system we are going to have what we call intralobular ducts, and then we're also going to have what we call interlobular ducts, okay, and then of course lobar, and of course the main excretory duct only. Now what we are going to see is that yes, the product that is secreted will go through the first part of the intralobular duct, and that is what we call intercalated duct. Now intercalated duct has what we call carbonic anhydrase activity, and therefore what it does is that originally the saliva that is secreted is actually isotonic, but eventually after going through the intralobular duct system, they become hypotonic. Okay, they become hypotonic to blood, okay, or to plasma. So here we are. What we see is that over here, because it has carbonic anhydrase activity, then it will secrete bicarbonate ions into the solution or into the saliva, and it will take away chloride ions. Now we get into the striated ducts. Okay, it has hydrogen, it has sodium potassium ATPase activity, so that what will happen is that it will take up what we call potassium ions. Sorry, to take up sodium ions, or reabsorb sodium ions and secrete into the saliva potassium ions. I've done these ones under the glandular epithelial tissue. Please go and visit that video to get more insight in this. So just to give a recap on the glandular epithelium I did. Now here we have what we call the goblet cell, unicellular gland. Okay, we're going to have it in the respiratory tract. Even the small and large intestine, we are going to find them there. Then there's a simple duct. No, it's actually a compound, compound. Now, if it is compound, is it, we are going to have what we call multicellular. Now, this is unicellular exocrine gland. Then we have multicellular exocrine gland. Now, the multicellular exocrine gland, it could be simple if the duct doesn't branch, or it could be compound if the duct, branches. So that if it is simple, yes, even the nature of the secretory units can also tell us, is it mucous, is it what we call alveolar or acina, or is it tubular? So you can see this one is tubular, it's like a tube, so we call it simple tubular gland. Okay, I've done these ones. Please visit that video. If it is actually, yes, this duct is not branching, but of course the secretory unit shows that kind of branching, and therefore we call it simple branch tubular. Okay, then of course this simple curl tubular, then of course this simple acina. Okay, simple alveolar, which you can see in sebaceous gland. Yes, if you look at this, yes, simple branch. Okay, simple branch too. You can also see it over here in the case of course, again, the sebaceous gland. But usually the sebaceous gland doesn't present more of the simple acina. Then if it is compound, yes, it could be compound tubular. So because the duct is branching severally, and the secretory units are flask shaped, so to speak, they are tubular in nature. Then of course, if you look at this, in the case of mammary gland, in the case of prostate, there's compound alveolar. So you can see that the duct is actually branching, that's why it's compound, and then alveolar, as you see. Now what we are doing right now is the major salivary glands, showing what we call compound tubulo-alveolar or tubulo-acina. So this one, the duct is branching severally, that's why it's compound, and they're actually tubulo-acina. So some of them are tubular in nature. Okay, these ones appear acina, and then some of them will also be tubular. Okay, this one is not really showing it. So that's what we are going to find. So that is one thing that you have to know. Now, whatever salivary gland you are looking at, okay, major salivary gland you are looking at, whether it's a submandibular gland, yes, sublingual gland, or or parotid gland, then you are going to have what we call a capsule. So all salivary glands will present with a capsule, Now capsule will impregnate the substance of the gland and divide it into septa, okay, so that we have what we call lobes, okay. So each salivary gland will have lobes, so that within the lobes we are going to have what we call intralobular duct, and then in between lobes we'll have interlobular duct. I'll show you these ones. Okay, you may see fast cells over there, yes, they are, which are pale, with their nuclei actually peripherally placed, empty space with peripherally placed nuclei. You see all those ones. Now, so I mean, that is one thing that we have to actually know. So if you take any gland, yes, it will have a capsule, it will have septa divided into lobes. Then we are going to have what we call duct system. In fact, interlobular duct, and of course, interlobular duct, we are going to have what we call, intercalated as well as striated duct, Please visit that video to get even more insight in this regard. Now we get to know that because parotid gland, which I will be coming to, will produce exclusively watery secretion, then it has to be modified adequately, and therefore it will have more of the intralobular duct, okay, than interlobular duct. But it is going to be exactly opposite to where we have the submandibular gland as well as the sublingual gland. Of course, we are going to have more of the intralobular ducts compared in the case of submandibular gland compared to the sublingual gland, because sublingual gland is going to produce more mucous secretion than the submandibular gland. So one thing that you have to know, I just want to show you this, that yes, saliva secretion will be made by the acinar, okay, and of course we know that apart from that, yes, enzymes will also be there. Now the saliva will contain all these electrolytes together with water, but what I've told you is that yes, sodium will be reabsorbed, potassium will be secreted when you get to what we call the striated duct. This one is happening at the striated duct, the cation duct. This one is supposed to have come earlier, because this one will be at the proximal part of the interlobular duct, which is the intercalated duct, which is having carbonic anhydrase activity, so secreting bicarbonate ion into the saliva and absorbing or reabsorbing chloride ions. Okay, so what happens is that yes, under the influence, the sodium potassium absorption is under the influence of what we call aldosterone. So that if the body realizes that there's less sodium in the system, then what will happen is that it has to reabsorb more sodium from what we call the saliva produced by the acinar, and then secrete more of the potassium ions. So you have to know in situations where there's low aldosterone in the blood and where there's high aldosterone in the blood, where there's high aldosterone in the blood, then it means more sodium will reabsorb, most of the potassium will be secreted. So within the saliva, if there is low aldosterone level, then sodium will actually go up because less will be reabsorbed, and then potassium will actually be high. Okay, but get to know the saliva which is secreted will be isotonic to plasma, but after the modification, then it will be what we call hypotonic. But get to know that this reabsorption is about ions and no water is reabsorbed, because these ducts are essentially impermeable to water. So we go to the next gland that we're going to look at its anatomy, and that gland is known as sublingual gland. So please get to know, yes, sublingual gland is actually the smallest of these glands. Okay, in fact the largest being of course the submandibular gland. Yes, of course the smallest being what we call the sublingual gland. Now in terms of its saliva contributes just about 5% to the total saliva that is produced. Okay, now one thing we are going to see the duct system. I'll actually go through that one with you. Okay, now one important thing is that it has little or there is little or no sympathetic influence in terms of saliva secretion. In fact, mainly it is the parasympathetic which has to take its place. I already told you that the sublingual gland, yes, will be very important in secretion of what we call mainly mucous secretion, although there's some bit of serum secretion, but the net effect will be that because it has more mucous cells than serum cells, it will be producing more viscous secretion, So that is an important thing that you have to know. Remember that if there's dryness in the mouth, then it's going to lead to what we call xerostomia. So if you are not producing a lot of saliva in your oral cavity, then it may result in what we call xerostomia. So just by telling you again, yes, this area, okay, this area will be the area where, of course, I've told that there's the mylohyoid line, okay, and then just anterior superior to the mylohyoid line, we are going to have the fossa for the sublingual gland. Yes, below it, posterior inferior will be the submandibular, gland, having its, area here. So one thing that we have to know is that the name is sublingual gland. So it tells us that yes, it's going to be below the tongue. It's going to be below the tongue. Okay, it will actually be below the floor of what we call the oral cavity. It will actually be part of the floor actually of the oral cavity. Yes, the gland, we describe it as being almond shaped, okay, being almond shaped. And importantly, yes, it's going to have what we call the left and right salivary glands, the sublingual glands, will actually meet anteriorly. I've told you that they are going to be paired, and they will form what we call a horseshoe configuration, and this one will take place around where we have the lingual frenulum. Now this is the lingual frenulum that I told you, the mucosal fold, which actually connects the tongue to the floor of the oral cavity. Okay, so that's one important thing that you have to know. But what happens is that there's an elevation, okay, that is created, okay, and that elevation is known as what we call placa sublingualis or submucosal fold, okay, submucosal fold. So as the ducts come, they create that kind of submucosal fold over here. So that's one important thing that you have to know, and they're actually going to combine around this area, okay, these submucosal folds, which are also known as placa sublingualis, yes, who meet at the midline, actually at the base of the lingual frenulum to form what we call the sublingual papilla, okay. So one important thing that you have to know is that I'm going to show you something, that the sublingual gland will have a lot of salivary glands, minor salivary glands, about 8 of them. Ducts, okay, minor sublingual ducts, okay, which we call them ducts of Venous. Okay, I'm going to show you these ones. They could be actually 8 or even go up to about 20 of them, okay, per gland. So the left one may have 8, the right one may even have 10. Yeah, there could be that kind of variation in some people. But I also show you that, yes, so essentially what happens is that I showed you that the Wharton's duct, okay, will drain, okay, around this area, okay, I showed you. So again, the sublingual ducts, the minor ones, also drain around the sublingual papilla, just like the submandibular gland. So there we are. Here we have the sublingual gland, and the sublingual gland is actually having a lot of these ducts, okay, and these ducts, yes, are known as the duct of Venous, okay, several of them. But there could be another one which may combine, okay. Now look at this is the ducts, the submandibular gland, duct of the submandibular, that's the Wharton's duct. It may combine with one duct over here, which actually we call it the major duct of the sublingual gland, and that one we call it the Bartholin's duct. So if you hear of Bartholin's duct, then we are still talking about the major salivary gland, the sublingual gland, its major duct. Don't confuse this one with the Bartholin's gland, which is the greater vestibular gland of the vulva, okay, of the vulva. Please get to know these ones. Okay, so these are it, how we are going to actually see it. Now in terms of arterial supply, yes, we have to actually look at the sublingual artery, okay, sublingual artery. Now this sublingual artery over here is actually a branch of this artery, which we call the lingual artery, okay, so that it gives that supply to the sublingual gland. So by way of, yes, blood supply, sublingual artery, which is a branch of the lingual artery. And you know the lingual artery is also a branch of what we call the external carotid artery. Then we also have, you know, another one, which if you can see over here, if you can see, we are also going to have what we call the, you know, the facial artery. You can see this facial artery. Okay, now the facial artery is supposed to give a branch over here, which we call the submental artery. Okay, submental artery is also able to give off some branches to supply what we call the sublingual, you know, gland. So these are the how the arterial supply to the sublingual gland is. Now for the venous drainage, what I'm interested in telling you is that everything will be drained into what we call the internal carotid artery. But one of them that we can see, yes, you can see the lingual artery. Okay, lingual vein. Okay, lingual vein. Now this lingual vein, you know, will actually receive a tributary from what we call the sublingual vein. Okay, and it will eventually drain it into what we call the internal jugular vein. Then even apart from that, we're also going to have what we call the submental vein, which are also going to, you know, produce, you know, bring in some saliva, some kind of return the deoxygenated blood back into what we call the internal jugular vein. Yes, by way of innervation, I've told you already that it will be via what we call, there will be pre-synaptic fibers, you know, which will actually come from what we call the superior, you know, salivatory nucleus. Okay, which, you know, we've said already. So that through the superior salivatory nucleus, yes, there will be pre-synaptic fibers, okay, coming in, okay, this way, and it will go through a branch of the facial nerve, being the chorda tympani, okay, which will actually join with the lingual, you know, branch, okay, of the mandibular nerve, okay, and then in over here they will synapse, the presynaptic fibers will synapse in what we call this ganglion, which is known as the submandibular ganglion, okay, and then eventually, yes, they will give off those kind of post-ganglionic fiber. They will relay them to supply these glands, which I've already explained. You know, actually that's the secretomotor pathway that you have to know. So by so doing, there will be dilator fibers, which will accompany the arteries, so that more blood will get in here to supply, you know, the gland, so that it can make more, you know, secretions. So that's one thing that, you know, we have to know. This is just the same as that we find in the case of the mandibular gland. There is this pathology, which we call it ranula. Now, in most cases, this ranula may not pose much problem. You know, that's actually a cyst that is formed. Okay, now it's more common in what we call the sublingual gland. Then we know that it's going to be least common in the case of, you know, what we call parotid gland, because parotid gland is going to produce only serous secretions. Okay, that's an important thing that you have to know, because the sublingual gland is going to produce more mucous secretions. Then what will happen is that, yes, sometimes if there is trauma to the ducts, okay, the ducts of the sublingual gland, then they could rupture. If they rupture, then the mucin, which is in there, may collect under the connective tissue. Okay, may collect there, and when they collect over there, okay, then it may form this kind of cyst over here. So as I told you, some people, yes, may not pose much problem, but in situations where it becomes too large, okay, such that it even results in painful swallowing, okay, that's what we call dysphagia. Then what happens? There will be the need for just surgical intervention. Okay, so that's one thing that you have to know. Even in situations, it will actually trickle down into what we call the cervical area. Okay, so there could be what we call cervical ranula, but essentially we are looking at these major salivary glands. Then it's going to be more common to what we call the in case of the ducts of what we call the sublingual gland, because of how it conveys highly, you know, mucous secretions. So by way of surgical intervention, if it is impinging, swallowing, then we have to make an incision through the mucosa, okay, over here, over the chest, and then you reflect it, and then you make that kind of slit within it. And this is what we call marsupialization. Okay, marsupialization is very important, so that you actually, you suture it, to the adjacent mucosa, so that this one is actually open, so that every secretion can actually drain outside, out. So that is what we call, marsupialization, which is going to be the surgical intervention, appropriate surgical intervention in situations where we have what we call, ranulus. Okay, ranulus. So we want to actually move on to what we call the Parotid Gland, which is another major salivary gland. Okay, so there we are. Yes, we know that the Parotid Gland is going to be, it's irregular, so to speak, and then it is going to be found, it's going to actually have an upper end. Okay, so here like this, we are going to have an upper end, an anterior end, and of course a lower end. Okay, but it's going to actually have, three surfaces. Yes, it's going to have a superficial surface. It's going to have, anteromedial, which will be deep there. Then going to have also the posteromedial aspect. So just like, the submandibular gland, the sublingual gland that we looked at. Yes, this was one of the major salivary glands. Okay, and it's going to be very important in producing enzyme-rich secretions. Okay, the enzyme, that's a taline or salivary amylase or alpha amylase, very important in that regard. Okay, so it's going to have an irregular shape, as we've already indicated. And then, yes, this one too, the lobe, we can actually divide it into two. You can divide it into a superficial lobe and of course a deep lobe, but I won't go into that much. So that is one thing that we have to know regarding it. But importantly, there could be an accessory parotid gland. There could be an accessory parotid gland, because at the end they are actually formed from these lobes, okay, embryonically, and therefore there could be that kind of accessory parotid gland. So that's the parotid gland again. So parotid gland, yes, let's actually look at the boundaries of this parotid gland. You can, as I said, it's going to be found actually, yes, in front and below the external acoustic meatus or external ear, but superiorly it will be bounded by what we call the arch of the zygomatic arch, actually zygomatic arch. Then of course at its inferior aspect, the inferior aspect, yes, will be related to actually the angle of the mandible, as well as of course the rim, the body of what we call the mandible, body of the mandible. And then anteriorly it will be related to this muscle over here, which we call it the masseter muscle. The masseter muscle will be here. And then of course posteriorly at the superior aspect, we are going to have what we call the external acoustic meatus, and at its lower aspect posteriorly we are going to have what we call the sternocleidomastoid muscle, okay, being forming that kind of posterior boundary. So these are the things that you are going to see. Now you get to know that there will be some kind of relations which we are going to actually see over here. But let me talk about the ducts of the parotid gland. Now the parotid gland, its ducts can also be given the eponym Stenson's duct. Okay, Stenson's duct. So this Stenson's duct, just like the Wharton's duct, is also roughly 5 centimeters long, and it actually emerges from the anterior aspect, okay, of what we call the parotid gland, of the parotid gland. So this one, will traverse this muscle, which we call the masseter muscle. Will traverse it, and then of course it will pierce through a muscle which I'm going to show you, which is actually the buccinator muscle, okay, to actually open out near the opposite aspect, near what we call the second upper molar tooth, or the second maxillary tooth. So I'll actually show you that one. But by piercing through, going into what we call the buccinator muscle, it also goes through some other structures. Okay, so that's the opening of the duct of what we call the Stenson's duct, or the parotid gland, the duct of the parotid gland. So it will actually go through, okay, from superficial to deep. You go to what we call the buccal fat part. You go to the buccal pharyngeal fascia, the vaccinator muscle, and then it will actually go through what we call the vaccinator muscle, go through the mucous membrane, and then open at the crown of the second upper molar tooth. So these are the structures. Okay, there's the parotid gland, there's the anterior aspect of the parotid gland. So emerging anteriorly, we are going to have what we call the duct of the parotid gland, traversing the masseter muscle, and then piercing through this fat with the buccal fat part, going through what we call the buccal pharyngeal fascia, then going through what we call the vaccinator muscle, and then of course going through what we call the mucous membrane to reach the opposite, actually the crown of the second upper molar tooth or the maxillary tooth. So these are the structures. That's the buccal fat part that we find over there. Okay, buccal fat part. Now there are some structures which are very important regarding this parotid gland. So the parotid gland is related to this important nerve, that's the facial nerve, cranial nerve 7, and this cranial nerve 7 is able to give off some branches within the substance of the parotid gland. So these are the temporal branches. There will be zygomatic branches, okay, there will be buccal branches, there will be mandibular branches as well as even some cervical branches. So importantly, it means that if we are doing any surgical intervention regarding the parotid gland, if for instance there's the need for parotidectomy, okay, removal of parotid gland, then care must be taken so that you reserve or you conserve the facial nerve. Otherwise there will be paralysis of the facial muscles. So that's an important thing. If for instance there's tumor, there's a neoplasia, which is a malignant which is cancerous, then it has to be taken out. Then there should be care enough by the surgeon to conserve this facial nerve. Very important. Well, apart from that, within the same substance of the parotid gland, there will be some branches of the external carotid artery. External carotid artery, after giving off this posterior auricular artery, which will go through behind actually the external acoustic meatus, it will ascend upwards, and within the substance of the parotid gland, it will also give off two terminal branches, and they are the maxillary branch and of course the superficial temporal branch, which may give off this transverse facial artery. Okay, so that is one thing that we have, and that is why the parotid gland, by way of its arterial supply, will be getting blood supply from the posterior auricular itself. Okay, it may also be getting some supply from what we call the superficial temporal, and even some part from what we call the maxillary artery. So we have to know this relation, very important, so that if there's any surgical intervention, then care is actually taken. Yes, again within the same substance of the parotid gland, yes, there will be that kind of vein which will actually receive 8 tributaries. So this vein, which is known as the retromandibular vein, will receive some tributaries from what we call the maxillary vein, as well as of course the superficial temporal vein. Okay, so to form this retromandibular vein. So retromandibular vein formation will take place within the substance of the parotid gland, and it may even give off these kind of so to speak divisions. We are going to have of course the anterior division and of course the posterior division. They will actually also take place in the substance of the parotid gland. So that's an important thing that we have to know. So by so doing, with respect to venous drainage, then it means that yes, it will also be drained, yes, by what we call, eventually it will drain into what we call the retromandibular vein, or because of course there will be some tributaries coming from the maxillary vein, as well as of course the superficial temporal vein. Okay, and then eventually it will be drained by what we call the retromandibular vein. Okay, so that's an important bit of information. Now, by way of innervation, so I've told you that with the innervation to these salivary glands, then we should be interested in talking about the parasympathetic. By way of autonomic innervation, we should be interested in talking about parasympathetic innervation. So there we are, we have the pons, and we know that pons will give us this kind of nucleus. This nucleus is supposed to actually be in the pons. So this nucleus is known as the inferior salivatory nucleus. So you can see that's how it is decreasing, so that at the end of the day, its synapses, it gives off this presynaptic fibers, okay, to actually this time around, yes, it will travel through, instead of going through the quadra tympani, which we've seen in the case of the sublingual and submandibular. These presynaptic fibers coming from the inferior salivatory nucleus will travel through what we call the glossopharyngeal nerve. That's the cranial nerve 9. Okay, and then will synapse. These fibers will actually be conveyed within the optic ganglion, one of the parasympathetic ganglia that we have. When we look at the neural anatomy, we look at the head and neck area proper. I'll actually go through these ones with you. Parasympathetic ganglia. So that yes, at the end of the day, what will happen is that through what we call the auriculotemporal nerve, okay, through the auriculotemporal nerve, the postganglionic fibers, okay, will be conveyed to what we call the parotid parotid gland. So it tells you that this one will help in what we call increased secretion by the parotid gland. The increased secretion will come because there will be increased dilation. So there will be vasodilation fibers also coming in to supply the gland. Okay, that's an important bit that we have to know. Now, one other thing too that we have to know is that if it is sympathetic, then it's going to result in decreased secretion, and therefore the fibers which will be released will be constrictive fibers, vasoconstrictive fibers. And remember, as we've already said, yes, that one will be coming from what we call the superior cervical ganglion. So that's an important bit of information that we have to know. Apart from the autonomic innervation, yes, the parotid gland, yes, the skin around the area, as well as even its fascia, will receive some supply from what we call the great auricular nerve. Now remember that the face will be generally supplied by what we call the trigeminal nerve. Okay, trigeminal nerve. Okay, very important. But just that area, the skin around the area, as well as the fascia around where we have the parotid gland, okay, will actually be supplied by what we call the great auricular nerve with its root values C2 and C3. Okay, C2 and C3. That's an important bit of information that we have to know. But even apart from this, what happens is that even the gland itself may receive some sensory supply from what we call the posterior division of the mandibular nerve. And that posterior division of the mandibular nerve is known as the auriculotemporal nerve. So if you are having mandibular nerve, its posterior division, okay, by way of the auriculomandibular nerve, will be supplying, giving some sensory supply to the parotid gland. That's an important bit of information that we have to know. Now, by way of some pathologies that we have, sometimes there could be aplasia or atresia. Atresia means diminution, but aplasia it may fail to actually develop at all. Okay, so it could be unilateral on just one side, or bilateral, both glands not appearing. It could happen to any of these glands, whether parotid gland or submandibular or sublingual gland. Okay, so if that happens, then there will be perhaps loss of there will be increased dental caries. Okay, because you can remove these particulate matter which may lodge in between the teeth, because saliva is going to help in these ones. Of course there will be decreased taste, because of course there should be dissolution of the chemical for taste to actually be sensed by these taste buds. The neuroepithelial cells of the taste buds, we actually look at those when we look at the tongue. Okay, so these are how we have to actually know. But the important thing that I have to know is the Sjogren syndrome. The Sjogren syndrome, yes, that syndrome is very important that you know, and that one results in what we call dry eyes and mouth. It's actually an autoimmune disorder. So there will be destruction of these salivary glands by what we call the cells, the immune cells of the body itself. Okay, so that's what we call Sjogren syndrome that we have to know. It's an autoimmune disorder, just like rheumatoid arthritis, okay, which being an autoimmune disorder. Yes, again, there could be some kind of infections which may result in inflammation of the parotid gland, for instance, leading to what we call parotitis or parotiditis. okay, which could be acute or chronic or recurrent. So it may come and go, but that's recurrent situation. And usually these infections, if it's bacterial, then it's poor oral hygiene, particularly among the elderly. Okay, so that's an important bit that we have to know. But sometimes it could result in what we call abscess formation. Okay, it could be suppurative, okay, actually resulting in that kind of abscess formation. So that area swelling over here. But one thing that you have to know is that there's a form of parotiditis or parotitis, which is actually a sort of viral infection. If it's viral infection, then we can also simply call it mumps. M-U-M-P-S, mumps. So by way of just give a brief comparison with regards to the histology or the main aspect, yes, the parotid gland, okay, in the adults will be entirely serous, will contribute normally to about 25% of saliva, okay, but if it is appropriately stimulated, then more secretion will be coming from the parotid gland. So if the question says upon appropriate stimulation by these major salivary glands, which of them will secrete more saliva, then you should know that it's coming from the parotid gland, especially in the anticipation of food, in the presence of fluid, food, smell of food and all that. But its duct is going to be very long because it's coming from all the way just below the ear, coming all the way. We'll have a very long duct for it to reach the oral cavity, okay, and it's going to have a lot of the intercalated duct. So the intercalated duct will be long and narrow, okay. We have a lot of these intercalated duct because at the end you know that the intercalated duct will be modifying the secretion, will be reabsorbing chloride ions and secreting to it bicarbonate ions. But for submandibular gland, yes, we know that it's going to have, let me say, about 60 to 70% of the cell acini being serous, 10 to 40% being mucous. Then normally it may produce more of the saliva, about 60%. Yes, it's larger than actually the parotid gland, as we know. Then of course it's going to have relatively shorter ducts because it's a bit closer to the oral cavity. So its duct will be quite shorter. Then of course the intercalated duct, it won't be as enormous compared to that, because we don't need much modification, so it's very short, so that yes, it's less developed, that's why it's going to be short. Then if you look at the sublingual gland, yes, predominantly mucous, going to have about 70% of its acini being mucous, and it's going to contribute just about 5% of the volume of saliva. It's going to have striated duct, will be very short. Now this one may even be virtually absent, okay, it may even be virtually absent. Then its intercalated duct will be inconspicuous, quite so that's one thing that you have to know. Remember, the reason why we are looking at these ones is that, okay, the intercalated duct and of course the striated duct, is that both the striated duct and intercalated duct will be modifying the secretion apart from being conduits, okay. So in both striated and intercalated, they will be long in the case of parotid because it's only serous. If it's serous, the secretion will have to modify. Submandibular, more serous than mucous, and that's why it will have longer in parotid. Yes, in that case, yes, shorter in the case over here. But essentially the sublingual gland, which is very important, yes, the striated may be virtually absent, then the intercalated that may be inconspicuous, may already even see it. Just to end this, and then in our future class I will look at some questions and answers regarding the histology, especially the histology of these glands. So let's look at it. Now I told you that every gland, salivary gland, will have a capsule. If you have a capsule, the capsule will invaginate into the substance of the gland and divide the gland into what we call loops. So those connective tissue that divides it are known as septa. So we call them interlobular septa or connective tissue septa. Now I said that if it divides it, then we are going to divide the gland into lobes and lobules. So that, for instance, this one will be a lobe, there will be a lobe over here. There are lobes. This one not really showing it clearly, but what we are going to find is that if you have lobe within a gland, then we are going to call it intralobular duct, okay, within the gland itself, intralobular duct. Okay, so you can see the striated duct. We need a high power to show all these features, the striations that we see, but essentially yes, there will be intralobular duct and interlobular duct over there. But the secretions will be coming from the acini itself, Okay, that's the source of production. That's the acinar, serous acinar. Because I told that in the adults we are going to have exclusively serous cells. So because we need more modification, then we are going to have more interlobular duct than interlobular duct. So in the future I'll show you all those ducts so that you can see it. Interlobular ducts. And that is why there is that kind of confusion if you look at the section of the parotid gland with the pancreas. Realize that the pancreas also have exclusively serous secretory unit. But in addition, the pancreas will have endocrine portion, which will be coming from the islet of Langerhans. That's one distinguishing feature that we are going to use. Okay, but then in addition, the pancreas will have more interlobular duct than intralobular duct. Now, this is actually the parotid gland, because we are having these cells staining intensely. Okay, staining actually intensely. If it were submandibular gland, then we are going to have more of the cells being serous, and a few of them will be very pale staining, which you will see. Then in the case of sublingual, then we have more of these serous secretory units being mucous, with few of them being serous. But then in addition, the submandibular and sublingual glands, we will be seeing what we call serous demilunes as well, those ones that I showed you. So I hope you find this tutorial helpful. In our future videos we'll be looking more into these ones. Please visit the other videos that I've done to get more insight, especially looking at glandular epithelia, look at even epithelial tissue, connective tissue, to get more understanding regarding these ones. I hope you find this tutorial helpful, and may God richly bless you.